The midday sun scorched the dirt streets of Dry Creek, turning the dust into a blinding haze that rose with every hoofbeat. Jonah McGraw rode slowly through the heat shimmer, the brim of his weathered hat casting a shadow over eyes that had seen too many battles, both in war and in life. His old horse, Buck, moved with the same weary determination as its rider. Jonah had only meant to stop by the general store for flour and salt before heading back to his ranch. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him, even when he wanted nothing more than to be left alone. As Jonah approached the town square, the noise hit him like a blow. Shouting, jeering, the chaotic roar of a mob on the edge of violence. His hand instinctively dropped to the worn handle of the Colt on his hip. He nudged Buck forward. What he saw made his blood turn cold. At the center of the square, tied to a weathered post, was a young Apache woman. Her dress was torn, her wrists bound so tight they were rubbed raw. A filthy burlap sack covered her head. At her feet lay a tattered rag doll and a small, dusty child's hat, offered up as proof of some unspeakable crime. Garrett Kane stood on a crate beside her, a stocky man with the swagger of someone too used to having his way. He was shouting to the crowd, his voice oily and triumphant. "They took Annie Laramie," Kane roared, pointing at the bound woman as if she were a trophy. "This savage knows where she is. Maybe she killed her. Maybe she's hiding her. We don't need to wait for the sheriff. We handle this now." The crowd roared its agreement. Men in sweat-stained shirts, women clutching their children, faces twisted with fear and rage. Jonah's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger radiating from them, fueled by Kane's words and the lingering tension between settlers and native tribes. Jonah's first instinct was to stay out of it. He was no lawman, no hero, just a man trying to survive on his patch of land. He started to turn Buck away. Then he saw her lift her head slightly, just enough for the sack to shift. Through the gap, her dark eyes locked on his, eyes filled with fire, not fear. It was that look, fierce and unbroken, that froze Jonah in place. His gaze dropped to the rag doll lying in the dirt. It was handmade, stitched with care. And for a split second, Jonah saw another little girl's face, his daughter's face, smiling and clutching a similar doll before the fire, before the screams, before everything went wrong. Kane's voice broke his trance. "Hang her now! Make her talk!" Jonah felt something ignite deep inside, a stubborn, quiet fury that refused to let the ugliness stand. He spurred Buck forward, cutting through the crowd. The murmurs grew louder as they recognized him, the silent rancher who rarely came to town. "Kane," Jonah said, his voice rough but steady, "untie her." Kane smirked. "What's it to you, McGraw? She's a savage. If you know what's good for you, you'll keep riding." Jonah swung off his horse. In one smooth motion, his Colt was out, gleaming under the sun. The crowd fell silent. "No one's hanging anybody today," Jonah said, his tone low and dangerous. "Not unless you've got proof. Do you have proof, Kane? Or is this just another excuse to spill blood?" Kane's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "You protecting her? That makes you no better than—" "I said untie her," Jonah's voice cut like a whip. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, muttering under his breath, Kane stepped down and sliced the ropes with his knife. The woman's wrists fell free, bloody and trembling. Jonah kept his Colt trained on Kane as he spoke to her quietly. "Come on, you're coming with me." With the crowd watching in stunned silence, Jonah helped her onto Buck's back and swung up behind her. He turned to Cain. "This ends here. You want to come after her? You'll find me waiting." The air was thick with whispers and hatred as Jonah rode out of town. He knew he had just made himself a marked man. But for the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. Jonah McGraw's ranch sat on the edge of the desert like an old scar, weather-beaten and forgotten. By the time he returned from Dry Creek, the sun was sliding low, staining the horizon with streaks of crimson and gold. He dismounted, tying Buck to the fence post, and glanced at the woman still sitting stiffly on the horse. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the square. Her posture was upright, her eyes watchful, and even now, after what she'd endured, she radiated a kind of quiet defiance. "Come," Jonah said simply, motioning toward the barn. She slipped down from the saddle, wincing as her bare feet touched the ground. Jonah's dog, Sam, limped out from the porch, sniffing the air. The animal cocked its head at Naeli, but didn't growl. Sam, like Jonah, seemed to recognize something beyond fear in her eyes. He led her to the barn and set out a bucket of water, an old quilt, and a plate with cornbread and jerky. "You can rest here tonight," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'll get you more food later." He didn't know if she understood, but she nodded once, a faint acknowledgement of his gesture. As Jonah stepped back outside, the familiar silence of the land pressed against him. The ranch stretched out in a mix of dust and stubborn weeds, the corral half empty, fences in need of repair. Once, years ago, this place had felt like the beginning of something, a home built with love and hard work, a dream he'd shared with his wife, Clara. Jonah leaned against the fence, staring at the horizon as memories crept in like ghosts. He remembered Clara's laughter echoing through the unfinished cabin, the way she sang softly while stirring a pot over the fire. He remembered the tiny hands of his daughter, Mary, clutching a rag doll made from Clara's old dress scraps. That memory stabbed at him when he'd seen the doll lying at Naeli's feet. Then came the other memory, the one that wouldn't let him sleep at night. He had been away on a cattle drive when the raiders struck. Clara and Mary hadn't stood a chance. By the time Jonah returned, the cabin was burned, the earth blackened, and silence hung like a noose. He'd buried them with his own hands, his tears mixing with ash. From that day forward, Jonah stopped believing in second chances. Until today. He glanced toward the barn where Naeli sat in the fading light, her silhouette framed by the doorway. There was something about her, about the strength in her silence, that unsettled him. She wasn't broken, not yet, and he couldn't stand the thought of seeing another innocent crushed beneath the boots of men like Cain. Jonah poured himself a tin cup of water and sat on the porch, Sam settling at his feet. His mind replayed the scene in the square, the fury in Cain's eyes, the blind hatred in the crowd. He'd made enemies today, not just of Cain, but of the entire town. Dry Creek had long memories, and they wouldn't forgive him for protecting someone they believed to be a criminal. The thought made Jonah's jaw tighten. He didn't care, not anymore. He stood, heading for the barn, carrying a lantern. Naeli watched him as he entered, her gaze steady. He crouched, holding the light close, and gestured toward her wrists. "Let me see." She hesitated, but extended her hands. The skin was raw, the cuts deep. Jonah cleaned them carefully, his calloused fingers gentle despite their roughness. "No one should be treated like that," he muttered. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Jonah saw in her eyes the same kind of loss he carried, pain too deep for words. As he left the barn, he muttered to himself, almost like a vow, "If they come for her, they'll have to go through me." The ride back to Jonah's ranch was long and quiet, the sun dipping lower with every mile. Naeli sat behind him on Buck, her body tense but steady, her silence heavy as stone. Jonah felt her presence like a weight, as if the very air between them carried all the fear, anger, and confusion that had brought them together. He didn't try to speak. Words were never his strong suit, and right now he doubted they would help. By the time they reached the outskirts of his ranch, dusk had settled over the plains. The land stretched endlessly around them, flat and bare, except for the small wooden cabin, the battered barn, and a few stubborn fence posts clinging to the horizon. To anyone else, it might have looked like the end of the world. For Jonah, it was simply home. He swung down from the saddle and offered a hand to Nayeli. She hesitated before accepting, her dark eyes narrowing, as if still expecting some kind of trick or betrayal. When her feet touched the ground, she staggered slightly, wincing at the raw cuts on her ankles and the bruises along her legs. Jonah said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "Come on," he muttered, leading her toward the barn. Sam, the old hound with a coat of faded brown, padded up to sniff at her. The dog's tail wagged once, slow but friendly. Nayeli crouched briefly, her fingers brushing Sam's head in a gesture that was both wary and gentle. Jonah watched from the corner of his eye, surprised by how quickly the dog had accepted her. Sam didn't take to strangers easily. Inside the barn, the air was cooler, filled with the scent of hay and old wood. Jonah set a lantern on a wooden crate, its glow flickering against the rough walls. He fetched a clean blanket, a tin cup of water, and a small plate of cornbread with a few strips of jerky. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, placing the food and water within her reach. "It's not much, but it's safe." Nayeli didn't respond, but her gaze followed his every move. Jonah noticed the raw red marks around her wrists where the ropes had bitten into her skin. He thought about offering to clean the wounds, but something in her posture stopped him. She wasn't ready to trust him yet. He left the barn door ajar and walked back to the cabin. As he sat on the porch steps, the first stars were beginning to appear overhead. The night was quiet, save for the rustling of the wind through dry grass and the occasional low whine of Sam settling beside him. Jonah stared out at the dark horizon, his mind restless. Dry Creek was a powder keg. He knew the townsfolk wouldn't let this go. Cain would twist today's events into something worse, painting Jonah as a traitor or worse. It didn't take much to stir up hatred in a place like that. He'd seen what fear could do to people. A low creak sounded behind him. He turned to see Nayeli standing just outside the barn, silhouetted by the lantern's glow. She was watching him with the same steady intensity she'd shown in the square. Jonah lifted his chin slightly. "You hungry?" he asked. She didn't answer, but the way her gaze drifted toward the cabin made him rise. He fetched another piece of cornbread from the shelf inside and handed it to her. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, a touch that felt like the first thread of trust. Jonah stood there for a long time after she returned to the barn, the quiet of the night pressing against his chest. He had no idea what he'd just brought into his life, but deep down he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. The night settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, the stars sharp and cold in the dark sky. Jonah lay on his narrow bed inside the cabin, the rough wool blanket pulled to his chest, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind churned with the image of Nayeli's eyes staring at him through the gap in the burlap sack, defiant, unbroken, but carrying a pain he knew too well. He turned onto his side and stared at the empty chair near the table, the one where Clara used to sit. For years he'd kept that chair exactly where it had been, untouched, as if her spirit still lingered there. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the wind howled through the plains, Jonah almost believed he could hear her humming. Tonight there was only silence. He closed his eyes, but instead of sleep, memories came rushing in like a flood. He saw Clara's smile, soft and warm, the way her hair shimmered in the sun. He saw Mary, his little girl, laughing as she clutched a rag doll made from Clara's old calico dress. He remembered how Mary would chase Sam around the yard, her laughter carrying across the fields. Then the memory shifted. The laughter vanished, replaced by the roar of fire and the screams. He'd returned home late that night, too late, riding hard after a cattle drive. He'd smelled the smoke before he'd seen the glow on the horizon. His heart had pounded as he rode into the yard, only to find his world in ashes. Jonah sat up, pressing a hand to his face as if he could wipe the memory away. But the images burned too deep. He saw Clara lying still on the ground, her dress scorched and torn. He saw the small shape of Mary beside her, the doll clutched tight in her tiny hand. He had buried them both with his own hands, the soil damp with his tears and the blood from his torn palms. It was that same doll he thought of when he saw the one at Nayeli's feet today. The sight had hit him like a blow to the chest, dragging all the pain of that night back into sharp focus. He'd sworn he'd never get involved again, never open himself to that kind of hurt. But there he was, standing in the square, aiming his gun at Cain and daring anyone to take another step. Jonah rose and stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. He saw the faint glow of the lantern in the barn, a sign that Nayeli was still awake. Something about her presence unsettled him. She was like a shadow from another world, carrying her own pain and secrets. Why her? He muttered to himself. Why had he risked everything for a stranger? He didn't owe her anything. Yet when he'd looked at her, he'd seen Mary's eyes, full of life, full of something worth saving. Jonah ran a hand through his hair and looked up at the stars. Clara's voice seemed to whisper in his mind, the way she had the night before she died. "Promise me you'll protect the innocent, Jonah. Promise me you'll do what's right." He let out a slow breath, as if answering her across the years. "I'll see this through, Clara," he murmured. "I won't fail again." Inside the barn, Nayeli shifted on the blanket, her eyes catching the faint light of the moon. For a moment, Jonah felt as though they were both caught in the same storm, two broken souls, each searching for something they'd lost. Morning broke with a pale light spreading across the plains, but the calm didn't last. Jonah knew that Cain wouldn't let what happened in Dry Creek pass quietly. A man like him thrived on fear and control. By rescuing Nayeli, Jonah hadn't just defied the crowd, he'd humiliated Cain in front of the entire town. Jonah was repairing the corral fence when he heard it, the distant drumbeat of hooves against hard-packed earth. He straightened, squinting into the horizon. A thin line of dust rose in the distance, growing thicker with each passing second. He could count at least 4 riders, and the way they approached, fast and tight, told Jonah everything he needed to know. "Stay inside," he called to Nayeli, who had stepped out of the barn to gather water. She froze, her dark eyes narrowing. Jonah didn't have time to explain. He grabbed his rifle from the porch and checked the chamber. Sam barked once, low and sharp, as if sensing the trouble ahead. The riders thundered into the yard, their horses kicking up a storm of dust. At the front was Cain's foreman, a thick-set man named Kessler, known for his quick temper and quicker trigger finger. He reined his horse hard, glaring down at Jonah with a smirk that had no humor in it. "Cain says you got something that don't belong to you," Kessler said, his voice carrying over the morning wind. "We're here to collect." Jonah planted the butt of his rifle against his shoulder, calm but ready. "You're not taking her." Kessler chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "You think you can stand against us, McGraw? Ain't nobody in Dry Creek on your side now. You hand that squaw over, and maybe we let you keep your ranch standing." Jonah's jaw tightened. The insult didn't surprise him, but the sheer arrogance of the man ignited something hot in his chest. "Tell Cain," Jonah said slowly, "that if he wants her, he can ride out here himself, and he'd better bring a coffin." The other riders shifted in their saddles, their hands twitching near their holsters. The tension stretched thin, like a wire ready to snap. Jonah's rifle didn't waver. He'd faced men like this before, men who believed they could take whatever they wanted. They were nothing but wolves, and wolves only understood one thing. "You'd better think real careful," Kessler said, his voice colder now. "Cain's got the whole town behind him. Folks already think you've gone mad, living out here with a savage. You want to be the next man swinging from a tree?" Jonah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You take one step closer, Kessler, and you'll be the first man buried under this dirt." For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a frustrated growl, Kessler jerked his reins, turning his horse. "This ain't over, McGraw," he spat. "Cain's coming for you, both of you." The riders wheeled around and tore off across the plain, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Jonah watched them go, his rifle still raised, his heartbeat steady but heavy in his chest. Nayeli emerged from the barn, her expression unreadable. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with tension. "Trouble," Jonah muttered, lowering the rifle. He stared after the riders. Cain wasn't just after Nayeli out of spite. There was something else, something Cain wanted to hide. Jonah could feel it, like the shift of wind before a storm. He turned to Nayeli, his voice low but firm. "If Cain's that desperate to get you back, then you know something he doesn't want anyone to hear, and I'm gonna find out what that is." That evening, as the sun sank behind the jagged hills, painting the sky with hues of fire and ash, Jonah sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle. The events of the morning replayed in his mind: the dust, the horses, Kessler's smirk, and the thinly veiled threat in his voice. Cain wasn't just angry, he was desperate. The barn door creaked softly. Nayeli stepped out, wrapped in the old quilt Jonah had left for her. She moved slowly, her bare feet whispering against the dirt, her eyes dark pools that caught the dying light. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching him. Jonah kept his head down, running a cloth along the rifle barrel, but he could feel her gaze like a weight. "You didn't have to do this," she said at last, her voice carrying the soft, lyrical tone of someone unused to speaking in English. Jonah looked up, meeting her eyes. "I couldn't just watch them hang you." Her lips tightened, as if unsure whether to believe him. She walked closer, stopping at the edge of the porch. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with unasked questions, with fear, and with the unspoken pain they both carried. Jonah broke it first. "They say you took the Laramie girl, Annie. Is it true?" Nayeli's eyes flashed, a mix of anger and sorrow. "No," she said firmly. "I would never harm a child. I have my own." Her voice faltered. "Your own?" She nodded, clutching the edge of the quilt. "My son. His name is Coda. He is 6 years old. He was taken." Jonah felt something shift in his chest. "Taken?" "Months ago," she whispered, her voice trembling but steadying as she spoke. "A group of white men raided our camp at night. They shot the men who fought back, burned our homes, and took our children. My son was among them. I have searched every trail, every shadow, but—" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Jonah set the rifle aside. "The doll and the hat? They are his," Nayeli said, glancing at the small items she'd placed on the porch rail earlier.
I carry them so I do not forget his smell, his touch. The townsfolk saw them and thought they belonged to this missing white child. They were wrong. But in their eyes, I am guilty just for being Apache." Her words stirred a deep, familiar anger in Jonah. He'd seen this before, how fear and hate could blind a man, could turn neighbors into enemies. And Cain, he realized, was feeding that hatred for his own reasons. "Cain wants you silenced," Jonah said.
"That means you know something." Nayeli's gaze sharpened. "I know his kind. Men like him took my son. They trade children like cattle, sell them, use them for labor or worse. I have heard whispers of a place where they keep them before moving them further east." Jonah's fists clenched. The image of Mary's lifeless body rose unbidden in his mind, and with it a surge of guilt and rage. "And you think Cain is part of this?" "I saw him," Nayeli said simply, "the night of the raid. He was there." The porch seemed to tilt beneath Jonah's feet. He'd always known Cain was rotten, but this was darker than anything he'd imagined. He leaned back, staring at the horizon where shadows were gathering. "Then I'll find out where he's hiding that girl," Jonah said. His voice was low, but there was steel in it. "And maybe your boy, too." Nayeli looked at him, her expression unreadable. But when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost like a prayer. "You have lost someone too." Jonah's jaw tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "Yeah," he finally said, "I have." The next morning, Jonah was already saddling Buck before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The cool dawn air clung to his skin, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Nayeli watched him from the porch, her dark hair loose around her face, her expression a mixture of worry and quiet resolve. "You're going into town," she said. It wasn't a question. Jonah tightened the saddle strap. "Cain's hiding something. If Annie Laramie's still alive, I'm going to find her. And if what you say about your son is true," he looked at her, his voice steady but fierce, "then I'll find proof of what that bastard's been doing." "You should not go alone," Nayeli said. Jonah gave a half smile, grim and tired. "I've been alone a long time. Don't worry, I know how to stay out of sight." By the time he reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, the town was waking up. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the clatter of wagons filled the morning air. Jonah tied Buck to a post behind an old blacksmith shop, choosing a path that would keep him hidden from the main street. He moved like a shadow, every step calculated. The general store and saloon were already busy, but Cain's warehouse, a large weathered structure on the edge of town, was quiet. Too quiet. Jonah's instincts sharpened. Crouching low, he scanned the perimeter. A rusty padlock hung on the front door, but the side entrance was less secure. He slipped a knife from his belt and worked the latch until it gave way with a faint click. Inside, the warehouse smelled of hay and leather, but underneath that was something sour, like fear and unwashed bodies. He moved past crates of tools and sacks of grain until he reached the back. That's when he saw it, a small wooden crate shoved beneath a workbench, its lid askew. Inside lay a child's scarf, stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. Jonah's breath caught. He knelt, lifting the scarf with careful fingers. The initials A.L. were stitched along the edge. Annie Laramie. His eyes swept the room again. In the far corner, behind a stack of crates, he found a battered rag horse, its mane frayed from use. A child's toy. It didn't belong here, not in this cold, dusty place.
Cain wasn't just lying about Nayeli, he was hiding Nayeli, and God only knew what his plans were. The sound of boots on wood snapped Jonah's attention to the door. Voices, two men, laughing, coming closer.
He ducked behind the crates, his hand tightening on the colt at his side. Through the slats, he saw two of Cain's men enter, carrying a sack of feed. "You hear McGraw's playing house with that squaw," one of them snickered. "Cain's gonna skin him alive," the other replied. "Says he's got a plan to deal with both of 'em once and for all." They dropped the sack and left, the door slamming behind them. Jonah waited until the footsteps faded, then slipped out the side door, his heart pounding. He mounted Buck and rode hard, keeping to the back trails. The evidence burned in his mind, the scarf, the toy, the overheard threat. Cain wasn't just a bully, he was dangerous in a way that went beyond mere hate. When Jonah returned to the ranch, Nayeli met him at the gate, her eyes searching his face. He held up the scarf, the embroidered initials catching the sunlight. "She's alive," Jonah said, his voice like iron. "And Cain's got her. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about that girl, and maybe your boy, too. We're going to bring this to light, no matter what it costs." By nightfall, word had already spread like wildfire through Dry Creek. Jonah McGraw had turned against his own kind. Cain's men wasted no time spinning their tale, painting Jonah as a traitor, harboring a savage woman and plotting against the town. Fear was a powerful weapon, and Cain knew how to sharpen it into hate. From the edge of his property, Jonah could see the faint glow of torches flickering in the distance, a mob gathering near the town, voices rising with anger. The sound of it carried on the wind, mingling with the restless cries of coyotes. It wasn't a question of if they would come, but when. Inside the cabin, Jonah laid the scarf and the rag horse on the table, his fingers tracing the worn fabric. He had proof now, but proof meant nothing to a crowd blinded by rage. He needed a plan. "We don't have much time," he said, looking at Nayeli. She was kneeling by the hearth, mending a tear in the old quilt with quick, practiced stitches. She looked up at him, her face calm but resolute. "They will come here," she said softly. "For you, for me." Jonah nodded. "Cain's stirring them up. He knows I've got something that can bring him down. If we're going to survive the night, we'll have to be ready." He rose and moved through the cabin like a man preparing for war. He checked his rifle, loaded his Colt, and stacked extra rounds on the windowsill. Then he started reinforcing the doors with planks and furniture. Nayeli, without needing to be told, began gathering water and food, her movements quick and efficient. "Here," Jonah said, handing her a small revolver. She hesitated but accepted it, her fingers wrapping tightly around the worn grip. As darkness deepened, Jonah climbed to the roof with Sam at his heels. From there, he could see the faint line of torchlight snaking toward the ranch. The mob was moving fast, shouting curses that cut through the night air. He could make out Cain's voice among them, booming and full of false righteousness. "McGraw's lost his mind," Cain shouted. "He's harboring the kidnapper, and now he's hiding Annie from her own family. We'll burn him out if we have to." Jonah climbed down, his expression grim. "They're almost here," he said to Nayeli. "Once they see the scarf and toy, they'll know Cain's lying. But we've got to hold out long enough for them to hear the truth." Nayeli's eyes met his, dark and steady. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Now I will stand with you." Jonah felt a strange warmth at her words, but there was no time for reflection. He poured a line of lamp oil near the fence line. One spark, and it would create a wall of fire to slow the mob. He placed buckets of water by the door and set a lantern on the porch. As the shouts grew louder, Sam began barking, low and furious. Jonah stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his silhouette framed against the dim light of the cabin behind him. The first torches came into view, a sea of faces twisted by anger and fear. Cain rode at the front, his black hat tilted low, his grin cruel. "Come out, McGraw," he bellowed. "Hand over the squaw, and no one gets hurt." Jonah leveled his rifle, his voice carrying clear and strong. "You want her, Cain? You'll have to take her over my dead body. And I promise you, before I fall, I'll take as many of you with me as I can." The mob hesitated, murmurs rippling through the crowd. For a moment, the night was poised on the edge of violence, and Jonah knew the storm was about to break. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that carries its own warning. Jonah stood on the porch of his ranch house, the rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Even before the first torchlight appeared, he knew Cain would come. Men like Garrett Cain didn't forget humiliation, and tonight Cain had brought an army. The wind carried the sound of hooves long before the riders emerged, a low rumble like distant thunder. Jonah's old hound, Sam, stood beside him, ears pricked, growling low in his throat. Behind him, inside the cabin, Nayeli sat near the hearth, her dark eyes sharp with fear, but not panic. She had been silent most of the evening, watching Jonah prepare the barricades, helping without a word. And then they came. A line of riders appeared on the ridge, torches blazing against the black sky. The firelight made their faces look carved from anger and malice. Jonah counted at least a dozen men, some he recognized from town, hard drinkers and hired hands, men who would follow Cain simply because they feared him or craved the chaos he promised. Cain rode at the front, as confident as ever, a dark silhouette against the torchlight. His voice boomed across the open yard. "Jonah McGraw, you got something that belongs to me. Bring out the squaw, and maybe we won't burn this place to the ground." Jonah stepped forward, rifle in hand, his boots creaking on the old wood of the porch. "She doesn't belong to you, Cain," he called back, his voice calm but carrying like a whip crack. "And neither does that little girl you're hiding. I know what you've done." A ripple of unease went through the men, but Cain's grin only widened. "You think you can stand against me, one man, alone? Look around you, McGraw. No one in this town's on your side anymore." Jonah's grip tightened on the rifle. "I'm not looking for friends, but if any of you take one step across that fence, I'll drop you before your boot hits the ground." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the restless snorting of the horses and the crackle of torch flames. Cain raised a hand, and the riders spread out, circling like wolves. The siege had begun. Jonah glanced back through the window. Nayeli was there, her hand resting on the revolver he'd given her, her jaw set. Their eyes met for a brief, unspoken moment, two souls who knew the night would not pass quietly. The first shot cracked through the still night like a thunderclap. Jonah didn't know who fired first, maybe one of Cain's nervous riders, maybe Cain himself. But the moment that bullet struck the corner post of his porch, the standoff turned into war. Jonah dropped behind the wooden railing, the rifle snug against his shoulder. He returned fire with calm precision, his first shot knocking a torch clean from the hand of a rider who was trying to set fire to the corral fence. Another shot followed, scattering the men as they sought cover behind the low scrub and hay wagons scattered near the yard. "Keep your head down," Jonah shouted toward the cabin.
Nayeli crouched low behind the window frame, the revolver clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes flicked to him, wide but steady. He saw in them not fear, but a fierce determination. Kane's voice cut through the chaos. "Smoke 'em out! Burn the barn if you have to!" Jonah cursed under his breath. The barn held not just supplies, but the only decent shelter Nayeli had.
He pivoted, aimed at the man rushing with a torch toward the barn door, and fired. The torch flew into the dirt as the man fell with a sharp cry. Then came the sound that twisted Jonah's gut, a yelp of pain from Sam. The dog had darted out from the porch, barking furiously at the advancing men. Jonah turned in time to see Sam stumble, a bullet grazing his side. "Sam!" Jonah's voice broke with a rare note of desperation. He leapt from the porch, firing as he ran, cutting down the rider who'd taken aim at the dog. Sam crawled toward him, tail thumping weakly. Jonah scooped him up and carried him back inside the cabin, his jaw clenched in fury. Nayeli tore a strip of fabric from her skirt and pressed it against Sam's wound, her hands shaking but swift. Jonah reloaded his rifle, his face grim. "They're not stopping. I've got to keep them back." The next wave came fast, 3 men sprinting low, using the shadows to their advantage. Jonah had anticipated this. He'd rigged 2 barrels of water above the fence. With a pull of a rope, the barrels tipped, sending a cascade of water and mud down, knocking the men off their feet. The gunfire continued, echoing through the night. Jonah's breathing was steady, but he felt the weight of the fight pressing in. This was no random assault. Kane meant to end him tonight. And Jonah knew this was only the beginning of the battle. The gunfire slowed as the moon climbed higher, turning the yard into a battlefield of shadows. Jonah crouched behind an overturned wagon, his rifle barrel smoking, while Nayeli stayed low inside the cabin, guarding Sam and watching for any man who dared get too close. The mob had thinned, some men injured, others retreating to regroup. But Kane's voice still boomed, urging them forward. "You can't hold out forever, McGraw," Kane shouted from somewhere near the corral. "Hand over the squaw, and maybe we'll let you live to see another sunrise." Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow and chambered another round. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath. A rustle of movement caught his attention. One of Kane's men had crawled too close, trying to flank him. Jonah fired a warning shot, forcing the man to freeze. "Drop your gun and come out," Jonah barked. The man hesitated, then complied, tossing his pistol aside and crawling into view. Jonah grabbed him by the collar and dragged him behind the wagon. The man was young, no more than 20, with fear etched deep into his sunburned face. "You got 2 choices," Jonah growled, pressing the rifle barrel to the man's chest. "You can talk, or you can stay quiet, and I'll make sure Kane's the least of your problems. Where's Annie Laramie?" The man's eyes widened. I don't know." Jonah pushed the rifle harder. "Don't lie to me. Kane's got her, doesn't he? That's why he's so desperate to shut me up." The young man swallowed hard. "Kane's got her in the old freight house, west side of town. He was planning to sell her, make it look like she died in an Apache raid. He's been using that story to rile up the town." Rage surged through Jonah like fire in his veins. He'd known Kane was a bastard, but this was beyond cruelty. "You're coming with me," Jonah said, hauling the man to his feet. "You're going to tell that to her father, or to God if Kane catches up to you first." The man shook his head violently. "No, Kane'll kill me." "You think I won't?" Jonah snapped. His voice was like iron. The man's gaze dropped. He's keeping the girl locked in a crate. She's alive, but I don't know for how long." Jonah released him, shoving him back toward the darkness. "Then pray I get there first." He returned to the porch where Nayeli was waiting. "We can't stay here," he said. "Annie's alive, and if we wait, Cain will move her, or worse. We end this tonight." The night was thinning toward dawn when Jonah saddled Buck once more, his movements swift and deliberate. The air was cool, heavy with the lingering scent of gunpowder. Behind him, Nayeli stepped out of the cabin, her revolver tucked into the sash at her waist. She looked at him, her face pale but determined. "You're going after her," she said. Jonah tightened the cinch on the saddle. "If we wait, Cain will move her, or worse. The freight house on the west side of town, that's where she is." "Then I'm coming with you," Nayeli said without hesitation. Jonah paused, his jaw tightening. "It'll be dangerous, more than tonight." Nayeli met his eyes, her gaze unyielding. "I am tired of running. If Cain is the man who took my son, I will see this through." He gave a short nod, acknowledging the fire in her voice. "Then let's ride." They moved quickly under cover of darkness, skirting the main road, taking the back trails that Jonah knew like the lines of his own hands. The town of Dry Creek slept uneasy as they approached, its few lanterns flickering like watchful eyes. Jonah signaled for silence and dismounted a few streets away from the freight house. The building stood like a hulking shadow, its windows boarded, its doors padlocked. Jonah crouched low, scanning for guards. Two of Cain's men loitered near the front, smoking and muttering to each other. Jonah whispered to Nayeli, "We'll circle around back, wait for my signal." She nodded, her revolver already in her hand. Jonah crept through the alley, using crates and rain barrels as cover. A loose board on a side window caught his eye. He eased it open just enough to slip inside. The interior smelled of damp wood and mold, but beneath that, something else, a faint, sweet scent of lavender. He followed the sound of a faint whimper. In the far corner, a large wooden crate sat against the wall, its lid barely nailed shut. Jonah pried it open, his heart pounding. Inside, a small girl huddled, her hair tangled and face streaked with dirt. Her blue eyes widened in fear. "It's all right," Jonah whispered. "Your name's Annie, isn't it?" She nodded weakly. Before he could lift her out, a voice barked from behind him, "Dropper McGraw." Cain's men had found him. Gunfire erupted. Nayeli, hearing the commotion, slipped through the back door, her revolver blazing. One of Cain's men fell, the other fled into the shadows. Jonah scooped Annie into his arms, shielding her from the chaos. "Time to go," he shouted to Nayeli. Together they bolted into the night, the freight house now behind them, and Cain's fury looming ahead. The first light of dawn bled across the plains as Jonah and Nayeli rode hard from Dry Creek, Annie clinging to Jonah's back, trembling but alive. Behind them, Cain's riders gave chase, fewer in number now, but relentless. The final confrontation was inevitable. Jonah pulled Buck to a halt on a rocky rise overlooking the open desert. The land stretched wide and bare, with nowhere left to run. He set Annie down gently behind a cluster of boulders, then turned to Nayeli. "Keep her safe," Jonah said, checking his rifle and revolver. "Cain's coming for me." Nayeli's eyes narrowed, her voice firm. "Then we face him together." The thunder of hooves broke over the horizon as Cain rode into view, flanked by two men. His black hat cast a shadow over his face, but his grin was unmistakable. "Well, look at you, McGraw," Cain sneered, dismounting with casual confidence. "You think one good deed makes you a hero? You think you can wash away the blood on your hands?" Jonah leveled his rifle. "I'm not here to wash away anything, Cain. I'm here to end it." Cain chuckled darkly. "You couldn't save your wife. Couldn't save that little girl of yours. What makes you think you can save this one?" The words hit Jonah like a bullet, but instead of breaking him, they hardened him. "Because this time," he said, his voice like steel, "I'm not turning my back." Cain drew first, his revolver flashing in the morning light. Jonah dropped low, rolling to one side, the shot grazing his shoulder. He returned fire, his bullet shattering the ground at Cain's feet, forcing him to dive for cover. The air filled with the crack of gunfire, dust flying as both men circled each other. Nayeli took down one of Cain's riders with a clean shot, while the other fled into the distance. Breathing hard, Cain and Jonah closed the gap, now fighting hand to hand. Cain swung the butt of his revolver like a club, but Jonah caught his arm, twisting it until the gun dropped. With a surge of strength born from years of pain, Jonah drove Cain to the ground. Cain lay pinned, blood on his lip, his eyes full of venom. "Do it," he hissed. "Kill me." Jonah raised his revolver, the barrel hovering inches from Cain's head. For a moment, the world stood still. Then Jonah's hand trembled, and he lowered the gun. "No," Jonah said, "you'll face justice. That's more than you deserve." Cain spat in defiance, but Jonah stood firm, the rising sun casting him in gold. For the first time in years, Jonah felt like the man Clara believed he could be. The sun climbed higher, burning away the chill of the night as Jonah dragged Cain, bound and bloodied, back toward Dry Creek. Nayeli followed close behind, Annie riding in front of her on Buck's saddle. The little girl clutched the tattered scarf Jonah had found, her wide blue eyes no longer filled with terror, but with a fragile trust. The town stirred as they entered, whispers spreading like wildfire when the townsfolk saw Cain tied to Jonah's rope. By the time they reached the center of Dry Creek, half the town had gathered, men, women, even Annie's frantic father, Jeremiah Laramie, who broke through the crowd to scoop his daughter into his arms, weeping with relief. Jonah tossed the bloodied scarf and the broken toy onto the ground. "This is what Cain's been hiding," Jonah said, his voice carrying across the square. "He kidnapped Annie. He planned to sell her, to blame it on the Apache. Every one of you was ready to believe his lies because of fear." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cain, bruised and beaten, spat dirt and snarled, "You'll regret this, McGraw." Jonah cut him off with a cold glare. "No, Cain, you'll answer for what you've done." He turned to the sheriff, a grizzled man who had long been under Cain's shadow, but now stepped forward with fresh resolve. "Lock him up and make sure the whole town knows what kind of man he really is." With Cain hauled off to the jailhouse, the tension that had gripped the town began to ease. Jeremiah approached Jonah, his voice shaking. "I owe you more than I can say. If there's ever anything I can do." Jonah shook his head. "Just keep your girl safe. That's all the thanks I need." Nayeli stood a few steps away, watching the crowd with a quiet dignity. For the first time, there were no looks of hatred or suspicion cast her way. Some townsfolk even nodded at her, shame flickering in their eyes. When the crowd dispersed, Jonah turned to Nayeli. "It's over," he said softly. She tilted her head, her gaze steady. "No, for me, it's just beginning. I still have to find my son." Jonah hesitated, then gave a faint smile. "Then you won't be searching alone." As the sun dipped low that evening, Jonah stood on his porch, watching Annie reunite with her family. The heavy burden he'd carried for years, the guilt over Clara and Mary, felt lighter now. He hadn't been able to save them, but this time he'd kept his promise to protect the innocent. For the first time in a long while, Jonah felt like the wind across the plains was no longer whispering of loss, but of a new beginning. If you like this video, please comment number 2. If you don't like it, please comment number 9. The morning after Cain's capture, Dry Creek felt like a different town. The air was still heavy from the night's violence, but the anger that once burned in the streets had cooled into a mix of shame and uneasy gratitude. Jonah stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, his shoulders sore, his shirt torn and blood-streaked from the fight. Beside him, Nayeli kept her head high, her dark hair loose, her gaze meeting the eyes of the townspeople without fear. Cain had been locked away in the back cell, cursing Jonah's name until his voice gave out. It didn't matter. The evidence Jonah had brought back, the scarf with Annie's initials, the rag horse, and Annie's own testimony, was more than enough to condemn Cain. For the first time, the town saw through the mask of its self-proclaimed cattle baron. Jeremiah Laramie approached Jonah, his hat in hand, eyes glistening. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done," he said, his voice breaking. Annie stood at his side, her hand clutching her father's tightly. "If it weren't for you, I'd have lost her forever." Jonah shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just don't let fear blind you again. Cain used it to make you hate the wrong people." The man nodded, shame clouding his face. He glanced at Nayeli, who stood quietly next to Jonah. "I owe you an apology, miss. I let myself believe things about you that weren't true. We all did." Nayeli's lips pressed into a thin line, but she inclined her head in acknowledgement. "I do not need your apology," she said softly. "I only want my son." Her words settled like a stone in Jonah's chest. Coda, her boy, was still out there somewhere, stolen by the same men who'd conspired with Cain. Jonah looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, and felt the weight of his own past pressing on him again. He couldn't bring back Mary, his little girl, but maybe, just maybe, he could help Nayeli bring her son home. By midday, Jonah and Nayeli were back at the ranch. Sam lay on a blanket near the fire, his side bandaged and his tail thumping weakly whenever Jonah came near. Nayeli knelt beside the dog, whispering something in her own language, her hand gently stroking his fur. Jonah leaned against the porch railing, staring at the wide open plains. "Cain wasn't working alone," he said. "That young man I caught, he mentioned buyers, people who pay for children. If Coda was taken, he's caught up in something bigger than Cain's schemes." Nayeli's gaze met his, fierce and unwavering. "Then we find them, all of them." Jonah studied her for a long moment. Once, he might have walked away. He'd have convinced himself it wasn't his fight. But not anymore. Something inside him had shifted. Nayeli's fight had become his fight, not out of guilt, but because it was right. "First, we follow the trail out past the Brazos," Jonah said. "That's where Cain's man said the raiders came from. We'll find someone who's seen them." Nayeli gave a small nod. "I will ride with you." As the afternoon light stretched across the land, Jonah saw the sheriff ride up to the ranch. The old lawman removed his hat, standing with an awkward sort of respect. "McGraw," he said, "I was wrong about you. The whole town was. Cain's facing a hangin', but there's still danger out there. You'll have my help if you need it." Jonah gave a short nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. That night, as the stars returned to the Texas sky, Jonah sat outside the cabin, cleaning his rifle. Nayeli sat nearby, sewing a tear in her blanket. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady. It was a promise. The sun bled orange and gold across the horizon as Jonah stood on his porch, leaning against the weathered post, a quiet witness to the world he had nearly forgotten how to love. Dry Creek lay still in the distance, its chimneys trailing thin curls of smoke, the echo of recent chaos fading into something resembling peace. In the yard, Annie laughed, a pure, unbroken sound, as she chased Sam, who, despite his injury, wagged his tail and limped after her with loyal determination.
Jeremiah Laramie had offered to take Annie home that morning, but the little girl had insisted on saying goodbye to Jonah and Nayeli first. Her laughter rose like music, cutting through the weight that had long settled on Jonah's heart. For the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. Nayeli stepped out of the cabin, her dark hair catching the glow of the setting sun. She carried a small pack slung over her shoulder. "The sheriff said Cain will stand trial," she said, her voice steady. "His men are giving names of those who bought and sold children." Jonah nodded.
"It's a start. But finding Coda," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the far-off hills. "That's a long road." "I am not afraid of the road," Nayeli replied, her eyes meeting his with quiet strength. Jonah studied her face, seeing not just the pain of a mother who'd lost her son, but the fire of someone who refused to be broken. In her, Jonah saw echoes of Clara, his late wife's strength, her refusal to yield even when the world turned cruel. "You don't have to do this alone," Jonah said finally. A small smile touched Nayeli's lips, faint but real. "I know." As the last light of day slipped below the plains, Jonah felt the weight of his past, of Mary, of Clara, soften. He would never forget them, but saving Annie had lit something inside him. Perhaps, by protecting Nayeli and finding Coda, he could honor the memory of those he had lost. The wind whispered across the grass, no longer speaking of failure or loss, but of second chances. Jonah took one last look at the plains before turning to Nayeli. "Tomorrow we start tracking, west of the Brazos. That's where the trail begins." She nodded, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Together they stood in silence, watching as Annie's laughter carried on the wind like a promise of a brighter tomorrow. If you found yourself lost in Jonah's story, his courage, his redemption, and the fight for justice on the untamed frontier, there's more waiting for you. True Wild West Stories is our ongoing series where we bring to life real and inspired tales of grit, resilience, and hope from America's lawless past. Subscribe to our channel to join this journey through the forgotten trails of history, where outlaws, drifters, and unlikely heroes carved their names into the dust of the Wild West. Don't miss the next chapter of courage and redemption. Hit subscribe, share Jonah's story, and saddle up for more true Wild West stories.